Saturday, and welcome to another episode of PO Cubed, your chronological guide to Nintendo's handheld consoles. This week, we're playing Golf, Pachinko Time, the Final Fantasy Legend, Shogi, and Fist of the North Star. Let's start the show. Golf, DMG-GO, developed and published by Nintendo. The third of the generically titled sports games released in the inaugural year could well be the one that holds up best today. Golf, like tennis, spawned a series of Mario-themed releases starting on the Game Boy Color. Not just a port of the NES version, Golf has two types of course to choose from, Japan and USA modes. USA mode is considerably harder, with more hazards and fewer areas of easy going. What's striking about this game is the randomly generated nature of the courses. The hazard placement is different each time, which is quite remarkable and offers a great replayability factor. Each shot needs careful consideration, and if you achieve birdies or better, you're rewarded with pleasing animations of Mario celebrating. In fact, the animations throughout are a really nice feature. There is a very enjoyable two-player mode, and also this game marked the first time that a save battery was included in a game pack, meaning you can save your best scores and put the game down after a hole and pick it up later. The music is nothing to remark upon, but in-game it is rescinded anyway, an excellent design choice as you really want to replicate that quiet contemplation you'd get on a real course. Some chirpy chiptunes clearly wouldn't fit in. The sound effects that fill the silence, though, really add to the atmosphere. The sound you get when you finally sink that ball is very satisfying. Everything is clear when you look at the bird's eye view of the hole, and the variety of clubs and their respective power bars have a marked effect on the quality of your strokes. It's a real thinking game, which is easy to pick up, but real finesse needs to be worked at. The wind needs to be taken into consideration too, and muscle memory can't be relied upon with the power of your shots, as it's different depending on which club you choose, the terrain, distance, and so on. Overall, it's a very well programmed little gem, which you need to put the time into studying. It's very rewarding if you do. Pachinko Time, DMG-PTJ, developed by Marionette and published by Coconuts Japan. There's a reasonable chance I'm not going to review every Pachinko game out there, as, boy howdy, they're all much of a muchness. I'll decide when I get to each of them whether there's any merit in discussing their finer points, or whether I simply refer to them in the Other Japanese Exclusives section at the end of the book. You won't be surprised to learn that they're all JP exclusives, because there's a good chance you don't even know what Pachinko is. For the unfamiliar, Pachinko is a Japanese physical arcade game somewhere between a slot machine and a pinball table without the flippers. Each board features a spiral layout with holes, bumpers, and slots, and you fire balls into it with various strengths, letting gravity do the work. You'll get something like, say, 100 balls to start with, and more can be earned in various ways. I'd surmise it's more luck-based than pinball, but I might get roasted for saying so. Like I say, there were a lot of Pachinko games on the Game Boy, and as far as I can remember at this point, they were all Japanese-only cartridges. I'm picking this one out because it's the earliest, and it gives me a good chance to write a bit about the subject. There is some semblance of a story here. You play as what looks like a ball bearing with arms and legs. You start on the northwest square of a map screen with several buildings. These represent various pachinko parlors, of which there are 8 in total. You'll need to try to make it to the goal at the southeast. Various bridges between parlors are broken initially and can only be repaired by scoring enough points on tables that you have access to already. Each parlor has 12 pachinko machines, for some reason labelled 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 15. I have no idea where the missing numbers are, but there it is. You'll need to beat 3 per parlour to leave, but more will have to be completed in order to fix all the bridges. On each machine, there are 2 numbers. The left tells you how many balls there are left, and the right shows a number, around 2000 at the start, that you need to try to reduce to 0. You hold left or right to alter the power of your ball launcher, with the aim of getting the balls into the slots. If you can get the balls into the large slot in the middle, the number will decrease even faster. The game has very little to offer in the way of skill. With no visual indicator of your power bar, you don't really know how much strength you're applying, and of course, the gravity acts on the balls in a random way anyway. Randomness is simulated pretty well as it happens. Hold A and speed up time by 100 times on an emulator, and watch how little of a pattern these shots do actually follow. You'd think that given enough results over time, things would tend to some sort of average, but they don't. I'll have to ask my physicist friends what that means. Anyhow, I'll maybe have a more in-depth look at a couple more Pachinko titles as we go along, but I can't promise they'll be any more interesting than Pachinko Time.
あの勇者たちが今ニューファミコンに出会う。ニューファミコンで蘇る伝説の物語攻略本付きファイナルファンタジー1、2一つになってアンコール発売。
The Final Fantasy Legend DMG-SA, developed and published by Square. The marketing wizards at Square had a major lightbulb moment when it came to translating Makai Tushi Saga into English. Tack the Final Fantasy name on the front. It wasn't a great stretch to pass it off, granted, there are plenty of similarities between this and the first couple of Final Fantasy NES titles. However, it proved to be a great move, as the first title in a super strong list of Game Boy RPGs would also become the first in the unbelievable list of million sellers for Square. The adventure follows 4 customizable characters who attempt to reach paradise via a tower at the center of the world. There are 4 worlds to traverse in total, each with a sub-quest to obtain magical spheres in some way, which allow passage to the next world. The game is replayable depending on the character choices, and although there is no immediately obvious leveling up system, each character has a unique stat improvement arc to take. There are 3 classes, the first and most obvious choice being humans, male or female. The gender makes little difference. Humans' stats don't improve after battles, you need to buy potions to raise them. You can buy HP boosts, an attack, defense, and agility increases. The amount these potions work is strangely random. Sometimes you get 20 HP, sometimes 1. So the less honest of you can save exploit. Of course, stats can be improved by equipping new weapons and armor. Humans are the most versatile in this area, they can equip most weapons in the game. Also, all characters have 8 slots into which all armor, weapons, skills, and spells need to be allocated. And humans are the only characters to have all 8 slots open. Mutants, on the other hand, have 4 slots pre-allocated for mutant skills. These are seemingly random skills that improve or decrease depending on how you use the characters. 4 slots can still be used to wear armor or equip spells and weapons. The skills are where the power of this class lies. There are skills that lower the stats of enemies, raise a defensive barrier across your team, or, particularly useful, an ESP skill that can prevent the damage from the next attack occurring. These are random, though, and seem to appear and disappear on an RNG whim. Similarly, the stats increase after battles, but somewhat randomly. It could be that the stat changes are down to the activity of the characters in battle. Use a magic spell and your mana increases. Take damage and your defense increases, and so on. It's certainly an interesting mechanic, and mutants form a key part of your squad. The third class is probably the most curious of the 3. Monsters may seem weak at first, and certainly they're the hardest characters to use. However, upon defeating enemies, occasionally meat can drop. For instance, the game will produce meat of skeleton, I'm serious, and ask you whether you want to eat it. For humans and mutants, nothing happens, but monsters can morph into various forms depending on the type of meat. Consuming the flesh of bosses makes you particularly strong, so it's worth sticking with these characters until you get further in. It's a very cool addition to the game. The overall look of the game, especially in the overworld, is very simplistic and generic. Everything is square, no pun intended, and angular. There's very little texture to look at. The enemies look sinister, and there's some enjoyable battle animation, but when you're walking around, expect to see the same handful of tiles. The music is by one Nobuo Uematsu, and while it doesn't represent his best work, it's still a wonderful accompaniment to an early 8-bit adventure. The dialogue is noticeably stunted throughout because, as commonplace with earlier games, the space allowed for text boxes was not changed. This meant translators had to fit the English into the same amount of character space as the original Japanese, which doesn't work. It's possible to say much more with a Japanese character than the equivalent number of English letters, so very often the story is shoehorned into place. It's a shame because, as games like Link's Awakening and Pokémon proved, captivating and expressive stories can be morphed from the original tongue. Use your imagination, though, and you can get past this. Final Fantasy was not the only series to suffer from this in the early years. The story has its fair share of RPG cliches, but will grab your attention, and it's certainly not dragged out. There's not much walking around, so the tale progresses nicely. Is this the greatest RPG on the system? Of course not. It's probably not even in the top 3. It's an enthralling tale, though, and despite its rudimentary visage, is wholly playable and enjoyable, with just enough uniqueness to make it treasurable for any JRPG fan. Shogi DMG-SGJ, developed and published by Pony Canyon. Shogi is loosely referred to as Japanese chess, which it kind of is, although there are a fair few differences. Some of the pieces are the same, there are pawns and knights, but some are different. The concept is the same, you have to capture the other side's king in a checkmate. And it's considered just as serious a game as the one we know as chess, with tradition and legacy hundreds of years old. Instead of pieces that roughly look like people, or horses, castle towers, or whatever, in Shogi it's traditional to have two-sided pentagons pointing in the direction of movement that have a kanji inscription of the real character name. And here's where the first hurdle lies in learning the game, especially for a non-Japanese reader. If a player manages to get a piece to the opposite side of the board, you can promote it. Rather than exchanging, say, a pawn for a bishop, you flip the piece over, upon which is a new inscription detailing the piece's new rank. This opens up new movement patterns specific to each new promoted piece, offering another level of strategy. The strategy itself is way too complex for me to detail here, especially because most of it is lost on me, but if it's something that intrigues you, then there are endless tutorials to teach you the intricacies. Shogi on Game Boy probably isn't that, but once you know the rules, it serves as good as anything to play the game. You can play a 1 or 2 player game, or there are also 60 unique puzzles whereby you join a game mid-session in varying degrees of jeopardy and need to figure out how to beat the AI. A pretty neat touch that elongates the appeal for more experienced players. Graphically, you have to say it does its job, however the kanji is pretty tough to read at times being so small. If you wanted the whole game on screen at the same time, there's not a lot of wiggle room with a 9x9 board. The pieces don't have that beveled point to show which side they're on, which only adds to the difficulty. The sound effects are pretty rough, except some very early voice synthesis. I think it's saying onegaishimasu, which is a way of saying please or thank you in normal conversation, but as I've now learned, can also be used at the start of a game or sporting contest to mean have a good game, reminding us just how valued politeness is in Japanese culture. Similar to Pachinko, this is the first of at least 7 different Game Boy games dedicated to Shogi, and I imagine I won't be reviewing them all. I'd love to play this game in real life against someone who could explain it to me as we go along. A versus CPU experience doesn't help much. Fist of the North Star DMG-HK, developed by Shogi System and published by Electrobrain in North America and Toei Animation in Japan. Something I really want to find out in the process of writing this book is whether or not there are any good fighting games on the Game Boy. There are plenty of them out there, but so often the two-button format, coupled with the small, monochrome screen, meant that even massive franchises such as Mortal Kombat or Street Fighter struggle to take anyone by storm, leaving expectant fans feeling lackluster and longing for a Mega Drive. Necessitating 2 copies of a game to play multiplayer really kills the strongest feature of games in this genre. Acknowledging these difficulties exist before you even turn the game on, it's only fair to look at what each fighting game does offer. Fist of the North Star is a Japanese manga that ran between 1983 and 1988, with a couple of movies thrown into the mix. It's set in a post-apocalyptic world, run by bands of mohawked outlaws, and is gratuitously and gloriously violent. The main protagonist is Kenshiro, a martial arts master who wanders from town to town looking for his kidnapped fiancée, while protecting the weak and helpless by making people's heads explode in ever more gory and savage fashion. Sounds like a promising premise for a fighting game, right? Sadly, this was a few years before Mortal Kombat would shock parents and delight teenagers with its inventive brutality. The developers did their best with the controls. Punches, kicks, and movement work how you'd expect them to. There's also a charge attack that's unique to each character. 11 fighters are available to choose from, and they all have a specific moveset. Once you've chosen your fighter, you proceed along your way through 10 big brawls for the King of Universe. You fight all the other combatants in a predetermined order, earning experience points and attack-defense boosts upon victory. It's a one-kill game over here though. Each fight is only 1 round, and if you lose, that's it. One of the biggest letdowns with Fist of the North Star is the lack of detail in the sprites. They're so small. Unless you pick the fat one, a lot of them are indistinguishable from one another. This leaves a lot of wasted space. The backgrounds are okay, but largely unvaried. The fighters can jump nearly 3 times their own height, but they still don't reach the top of the screen. On the character select screen, you don't even get a close-up of your fighter, which is an inexcusable lack of effort. The driving, heart-pumping music you'd expect is there in parts, not in others, and it's always shrill. It's as if the bass channel was forgotten completely. The sound effect, note the use of the singular there, is shallow and thin, with no real sense of heavy contact when your blows land. There may be a decent fighting game on the Game Boy, but Fist of the North Star isn't it. They should have put at least 1 head explosion in there. Thanks for listening to the Portable Power Podcast. If you want to support the show, the best way to do so is on Patreon at patreon.com/Portable Power Podcast. Or subscribe on the YouTubes. We have daily uploads Monday to Friday, where you can watch me suck at the games as I talk about them. You can tweet me at POCubed or on any of the other socials you might expect. Thanks again and have a great weekend.